knowledge, self-determination. So today, to pay respect, tribute, and homage to Dr. Martin Luther King, I'll be reading some passages from the book Black Profiles, written by George R. Metcalf, that were dedicated to the life of Dr. Martin Luther King. I'm going to be skipping through basically the first chapter of the book, which is dedicated to Martin Luther King, as to not completely plagiarize this man's work, and to not make the video ridiculously long. So I'll just go ahead and begin. It kind of starts in 1960, then it goes back to the past and tells the story in ascending order from that point. So just bear with that. During the long hot summer of 1963, at the height of the Negro Revolution, Newsweek magazine overtook a survey of Black America to sort out the leaders in the uprising. Countless interviews with rank-and-file Negroes, as well as 100 carefully chosen prominent people from coast to coast, revealed the fact that, among the 14 names mentioned, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. of Alabama stood first. The reasons for this choice are an enigma, for the Reverend King does not possess the characteristics of a folklore hero in the historic mold. He is not physically impressive. His 5'7" frame is hardly staring to a nation used to tall men. Only his heavily muscled neck supporting a massive head reveals his hidden strength. Soft-spoken, he is not given to talk about himself. As though to make himself unobtrusive, he wears black suits with black ties. He is a disciple of nonviolence in a country where the murder rate is roughly 10,000 a year, and where since 1900 more than 750,000 persons have died from guns alone. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta on January 15, 1929. Traces of Irish and Indian blood flow in his veins. Irish from his father's side, Indian from his mother's. His maternal grandfather, the Reverend A.D. Williams, built the renowned Ebenezer Baptist Church and was a leader of the NAACP during the menacing 20s when the Ku Klux Klan rode hard on troublesome blacks. When an Atlanta newspaper belittled Negro voters, he would not rest until the offending publication had been boycotted out of existence. King's paternal grandfather had no such lofty ideals. He was, as James Baldwin has described him, quote, a poor, violent, and illiterate farmer who tried to find refuge from reality in drinking, end quote. He functioned as an example to his children of what not to do. Consequently, King's father grew up a sober, thrifty man who moved to Atlanta in 1916, determined to make his mark in the world. After nearly a decade of eking out a meager living in various jobs, he finally turned to the ministry and entered Atlanta's Morehouse College, working days and attending night school. He graduated in June of 1930, some 17 months after Martin Jr. was born. I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead now. In fact, I'm going to read this part. I really like this part right here. It's like half of the, not even half of the paragraph, a little bit less than half. But just to give you guys an idea of how superior this man's intellect was, Martin Luther King Jr. A talented student, Martin skipped several grades, went through high school in 2 years, and was ready to enter Morehouse College at 15. At 15, despite the appeals of Martin Sr., who wanted him to become a minister, he held back. Quote, I had doubts that religion was intellectually respectable. I had revolted against the emotionalism of Negro religion, shouting and stamping. I didn't understand it, and it embarrassed me, end quote. But I just wanted to... He skipped several grades, went through high school in 2 years, and was ready to enter Morehouse College at 15. That That's genius level intellect. That's genius level intellect. And look what this man did. Not as an athlete, but as an intellectual. He changed the world. Now, I'll read a little bit of this. This goes up to 1953. So I'll read a little bit of this and then I'll skip ahead a little bit more to not take up so much time. When Martin and Coretta met, they were a study in contrast. Fresh from Crozer, he was still overreacting against the stereotype Negro image. Quote unquote, an endeavor, as James Baldwin points out, quote, which does not leave much room for spontaneity, end quote. Coretta, on the other hand, was high-spirited, a girl who evidently sent Martin's head swimming. He had enough composure, however, to announce, after the first date, that she was the girl who made him forget all others. Coretta was reluctant. There simply were too many complications. She could not forget the sacrifices her family had made to give her a career in singing. I'll go ahead and skip ahead a little bit more. The two eventually married on the front lawn of their home in Marion on January 18, 1953. They returned to Boston to complete their studies. And now, skipping ahead to December 1955, seamstress Rosie Parks refused to move from her seat on a city bus when ordered to make way for a white passenger. From that small event, the black revolt against white intransigency finally blossomed. Quote, if you had asked me the day before, end quote, said Queen, quote, whether any action could or would have been taken by the Negroes, I'd have said no. Then, all of a sudden, unity developed, end quote. A one-day protest grew into an effective year-long boycott. I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead a little bit more. Like I said, to not take up so much time. Let's see. Then we're going to skip. This is February 1956. Unimpressed, the 80,000 Montgomery whites failed to heed either Martin's appeal or his oratory. They harassed him with scurrilous telephone calls, hoping to overwhelm his resistance. Quote, one night after many threatening and annoying phone calls, I went into the kitchen and tried to forget it all, end quote, King recalls. Quote, I found myself praying out loud, and I laid my life bare. I remember saying, I'm here, taking a stand, and I've come to the point where I can't face it alone, end quote. It was a moment of excruciating doubt. A man of nonviolence, he struggled to overcome physical fear. Suddenly, a voice whispered, quote, all is well, God is near, be strong, end quote. From that moment, claims Martin King, quote, I have not known fear, end quote. King's advocacy of nonviolence frustrated the white racists who had previously settled all differences with force. The boycott had been underway a bare 10 weeks when violence broke out. One night in February 1956, King had gone to a mass meeting. Coretta remained home, entertaining a friend in the front room. Suddenly, an object came sailing out of the darkness and landed with a thud on the front porch. More to avoid being disturbed than from fear, the two stood up and moved to a room at the rear of the house, just in time to escape the blast of dynamite which bathed the vacant room with a shower of glass. This is how violent that time period was. That was a horrible, horrible thing to do to somebody. They literally were trying to kill people. You know, when black people talk about the racism that this country has delivered onto us by the white majority, these are the types of things that we're talking about, you know. And it may not be done in this fashion, in this particular fashion anymore, or any overwhelmingly overt fashion, but it still continues. And we make a big deal about it because nobody else will. We make a big deal about it because even if say instances of police brutality have gone down. Say that is the case, but they haven't stopped. The fact of the matter is, being treated like this is something that has happened too much to us. And the question is, when is it going to end? When is it going to stop? So, I'm going to continue on. Now, this takes us to 1960. During the first 3 years of SCLC's existence, and for those of you who don't know, that is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, King continued as pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Montgomery, but frequent absences from home made the pressures more and more burdensome. On the occasions he returned to Montgomery, his telephone rang constantly with questions and complaints, all requiring immediate attention. Finally, in February 1960, Dr. King left his Montgomery post to preside full-time over the SCLC headquarters in Atlanta. King had lately slipped from public view. Press, radio, and television were not scrutinizing his every move, as had once been the case in Montgomery. As Loudon Wainwright wrote in Life magazine, people were beginning to remark, quote, that King is a great cat. That King is a great cat, but what's he done lately, end quote. So let's skip ahead. Let's see. In the months that followed the election, King despaired, wondering whether Kennedy's action had been a political ploy undertaken in a final desperate moment when victory hinged on a hidden source of campaign strength. After showing concern for the Southern leader during his arrest and promising to end discrimination in housing with, quote, the stroke of a pen, end quote, the president had acted feebly in the face of conservative pressure. At the time of Kennedy's inauguration, King had written in one of his annual progress reports for The Nation magazine, quote, the intolerably slow pace of civil rights is due at least as much to the limits which the federal government has imposed on its own actions as it is to the actions of the segregationist opposition. We must face the tragic fact that the federal government is the nation's highest investor in segregation, end quote. He added, FHA continues to finance private developers who openly proclaim that none of their homes will be sold to Negroes. A truly decisive president would work passionately and unrelentingly to change these shameful conditions, end quote. So this is Martin Luther King's struggle that he had to deal with President Kennedy. Now, Kennedy has gone down in history as a president who was a champion for black people. But listen to what Martin Luther King Jr. is saying. You understand? Listen to what he's saying. Intolerably slow pace. He's of civil rights is due at least as much to the limits which the federal government has imposed on its own actions as it is to the actions of the segregationist opposition. Highest investor in segregation, the federal government. A truly decisive president. Would work passionately and unrelentingly. Let's continue on. By 1963, the question was, quote unquote, would he? King's answer was no. There had been fumbling on the new frontier. In failing to sign an executive order to end discrimination in housing, Kennedy had, quote unquote, undermined confidence in his promise to black Americans. The failure, King said, was due to a lack of commitment by men who, quote, waged an essentially cautious and defensive struggle for civil rights against an unyielding adversary. When the nation feels threatened by war, a military budget is freely spent to achieve security. Yet, not even $1 billion a year is spent by government on behalf of 20 million Negroes seeking to defend themselves from the persistent attack on their civil rights, or their rights rather, end quote. Quote unquote, the president, he cried, quote, has proposed a 10-year plan to put a man on the moon. We do not yet have a plan to put a Negro in the state legislature of Alabama, end quote. What King wanted was evidence of moral leadership that would communicate its quote-unquote strength to waiting millions. Recalling Victor Hugo's famous statement that, quote, nothing in the world is stronger than an idea whose time has come, end quote. He said it was time the president sounded the trumpet to advance. That's deep. That's deep what Martin Luther King Jr. was saying. He's putting pressure on the nation and on the president at the time, you know, JFK, John F. Kennedy Jr., or rather John F. Kennedy, to do something for black people. I mean, we have almost bottomless military budget, you know. You can spend billions of dollars, you know, to send somebody to the moon. You know, has a proposed 10-year plan to put a man on the moon. But the black community can't get $1 billion. Not even $1 billion a year is spent by government on behalf of 20 million Negroes seeking to defend themselves from a persistent attack on their rights. End quote. Martin Luther King was serious about this. And this just sheds a little bit of light on some of who the character and personality, I would assume, of John F. Kennedy. Was he really a champion for black people? Or was he pressured into doing the things he did for black people out of politics, not an actual emotional connection, not empathy or sympathy, or just out of the sheer thought of it just being the right thing to do? Makes you wonder. Let's see. So I'm gonna go ahead and skip ahead some more again because I don't want to take up too much time. So let's skip ahead. Let's see. The days roll by, but before the summer's great storm of protests reached its final crescendo, A. Philip Randolph, founder and president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, urged the major Negro organizations to mount a march on Washington that would galvanize the nation and arouse Congress to immediate enactment of the Kennedy Civil Rights Bill. So, we did get the bill. I mean, as we all know, the Civil Rights Bill from Kennedy, we got it, but look at what it took to get there. And A. Philip Randolph is another brother who definitely should be mentioned in Black history and during Black History Month, all year round, actually. Like I said, founder and president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He was a major figure in civil rights. He was a major figure. Let's see, Randolph was well qualified for the role. Born 74 years before in Crescent City, Florida, the son of a circuit-riding African Methodist Episcopal Church minister, he had been a lifelong champion of the Negro cause. As a boy of 9, he had watched while a group of blacks prevented a lynching by standing guard all night in front of the county jail. Out of this experience, he had learned the meaning of strength through mass action. Quote, "I'll never forget," end quote. He said, quote, "It had a tremendous effect on me," end quote. Let's see. In 1941, he used psychology on President Franklin D. Roosevelt to goad him into action. Roosevelt tried desperately to counter the threatened march on the Capitol. Finally, he saw his words were of no avail. He issued the order creating the Fair Employment Practices Commission. Only then did Randolph cancel the march. In 1948, the Negro leader returned to the White House, this time to tell Harry Truman that black Americans would not be drafted into a Jim Crow army. Shortly thereafter, the White House issued an executive order integrating the armed services. A decade later, he met with President Eisenhower to urge greater speed on civil rights and swifter enforcement of the Brown decision desegregating the public schools. That was the Brown versus Board decision, for those of you who don't know that. The president, quote, "The president was very pleasant, full of goodwill," end quote, said Randolph. Quote, but without apparent familiarity with the problems of the Negro people or readiness to do anything about them, end quote. To move Kennedy, he decided to employ a mass march that had worked so effectively on Roosevelt. Day and night, he and his chief aide, Bayard Rustin, another key person in civil rights movement, sent out calls urging Negroes and white sympathizers to march on Washington on Wednesday, August 28. So well was the march organized that on the appointed day, more than 200,000 descended on the Capitol, marching from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial, where a dozen speakers addressed the vast crowd. When it came Dr. King's turn to speak, Randolph introduced him as, quote, the moral leader of the nation. King spoke of the nation's default on its promissory note to Negroes, contained in the, quote, magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, end quote, and how the marchers had come, quote, to cash this check, end quote. But he continued, he cautioned them against, quote, wrongful deeds, end quote, in obtaining their, quote unquote, rightful place. Then, in the moving words of a latter-day prophet, he spoke of a dream. Quote, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day, on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, end quote. Gathering emotion as he went, he brought his speech to a stirring conclusion. Quote, when we let freedom ring, end quote, he cried, quote, we will let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city. We will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing, in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last, end quote. That was one of the greatest speeches ever delivered, I think, anywhere. Let's see. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit more because video is starting to run a little bit long, and I'm just going to read this one last section here, and then I'll probably call it an end, or probably do a part 2 to this video, because I'm not going to just relegate celebrating someone as great as Dr. Martin Luther King to just one day in one video. You know, it's my YouTube channel. I can go in on this man's life as long as I want and read stories about him as many times as I want. And if it's for the benefit of our people to do so, then I will do so. However, let me continue. Yet, Sumner had given King's campaign for voter registration in the South a remarkable thrust. Congress was aroused at last to the need for more legislation. Birmingham had spurred the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, Selma was the catalyst which brought about the 1965 Voting Rights Act. For Martin King, it was also the end of a chapter in his fight for black freedom. To this point, he had labored almost entirely in the South against open segregation. There had been campaigns to achieve, quote, human dignity, eating in restaurants, studying in schools, traveling in public conveyances, side by side with whites, end quote. Progress had been made. Now, there were new areas of need to contemplate. Indeed, as King had written in Ebony, just prior to the Selma March, the demands for his involvement in national and international problems began to quote-unquote mushroom, from the moment he was chosen winner of the 1964 Nobel Peace Prize. Quote, thus, though I will continue to give primary attention to the problems of the South, end quote, he said, quote, I realize I must more and more extend my work beyond the borders of the South, end quote. The more King saw, the more disenchanted he became with conditions north of the Mason-Dixon line. Quote, I encountered the tragic and stubborn fact, end quote, he declared darkly. quote, that in virtually no major city was there a mayor possessing statesmanship, understanding, or even compassion on the civil rights question. Many of them sat on platforms with all the imposing regalia of office to welcome me to their cities and showered praise on the heroism of Southern Negroes. Yet, when the issues were joined concerning local conditions, only the language was polite. The rejection was firm and unequivocal, end quote. The attitude in the North towards civil rights legislation was at best disappointing. Measures were passed at the state and municipal level, quote, without passion or evident conviction. Feeble and anemic enforcement amid political machinations made them all but ineffectual. It was worse than tokenism. It was trifling with life and death issues with unfailing clumsiness and opportunism, end quote. In August 1965, King received first-hand evidence of the damage quote-unquote tokenism could do. In the predominantly Negro district of Watts, in riot-torn Los Angeles, a grotesque racial explosion took the lives of 43 residents and destroyed property valued at $250 million. Immediately afterward, King visited the ghetto to talk to the residents. He was greeted with mutterings of frustration and contempt. Quote, they're just sending another nigga down here to tell us what we need, end quote. Quote, I had a dream. Hell, we don't need no damn dreams. We want jobs, end quote. After that, King huddled with several local Negro leaders to listen to complaints, talked with Mayor Sam Yorty, and suggested to Police Chief William Parker that the established Civil Police Review Board to sift out complaints of police brutality. So I'm gonna go ahead and end there with this with just look into the life of Dr. Martin Luther King. Let's see. And that one, before I started reading the August 1965 passage, I just wanted to go back and highlight how people think that the North was so great for black people, that the South was just horrible and the North was just, the land of milk and honey. The North was just as bad as the South. They really were. Racism, racial disparity, and discrimination did not recede at the Mason-Dixon line. The systematic racism and white supremacy, it knows no boundaries. But I'm gonna leave it with that. I will make another video going into the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., picking up from where I left off. And yeah, if anybody has any little known facts about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., they can leave comments in the comment section. I'll do another video soon about the brother here, the ancestor here, and how great he was for our people. So yeah, like, learn, and subscribe. Peace.